The rain had a rhythm of its own that morning. Steady, fragile, endless. It traced uneven rivers down Evelyn Marin's studio windows, blurring the pale harbor beyond into muted streaks of silver and blue. She sat cross-legged before her easel, one hand trembling around a thin brush, the other smudged with shades of ochre and ash. The canvas in front of her carried the outline of a man she had never met, yet his eyes seemed to look back at her with the familiarity of a forgotten dream. She had painted him 100 times in 100 different ways, sometimes smiling faintly, sometimes staring into nothing, sometimes standing in the rain like she was now. His face came to her without effort, like breathing. It frightened her how easily her hand moved, how naturally she knew the slope of his jaw, the sadness in his gaze. When she tried to paint other things, the sea, the docks, a still life of flowers, the brush would always drift back to him, as if her heart remembered what her mind could not. Her small attic studio smelled of turpentine and old wood. Paint tubes lay scattered across the floor like tiny fallen soldiers, and the sound of the sea hummed faintly beneath the roof. It was her world, quiet, contained, a place where time slipped softly past without notice. Outside, the town of Whitestone Harbor moved slowly. Fishermen hauled nets, children chased stray cats, and the bell tower rang each hour with a sound that reminded Evelyn of distance. Before we begin this story, tell us, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it there? Now, let's begin. Evelyn had lived alone since her mother's passing 2 years ago. The cottage had belonged to her family for generations, and though the walls had faded with salt and age, it still smelled faintly of lavender and sea air. Every morning she opened the window facing the ocean, letting the wind carry in the taste of salt and memory. She told herself she was content, yet the silence inside those rooms had begun to feel like a slow kind of drowning. Her only companion was her art, though even that brought her more questions than peace. The townspeople often said her paintings were too sad to hang, too intimate to belong to strangers. The few who came to her exhibits admired her skill, but left uneasy, as though they'd glimpsed a secret not meant for them. She couldn't blame them. Each portrait she painted seemed to hold a piece of something she didn't understand, faces of people she had never seen, yet felt she might have loved once. One afternoon, while she arranged her canvases for the small local gallery, her friend and gallery owner, Mr. Hollis, entered with a letter clutched in his hand. His face was pale with disbelief. "Evelyn," he said, catching his breath, "you won't believe this. Someone has bought every one of your paintings." She laughed softly, thinking he was joking. "All of them? That's impossible." But he only nodded, setting the envelope on her work table. "Every single one. Paid in advance. No address, no message, just initials. A-R-E-I. For a moment she stood still, her mind refusing to process the words. No one had ever bought more than one of her pieces before. She felt the ground tilt beneath her feet, the way it does when something ordinary suddenly becomes strange. The letters meant nothing, and yet they felt heavy in her mouth, like the beginning of a memory she couldn't finish. That night she couldn't paint. She sat by the open window, watching the fog roll in from the sea. The wind carried the scent of rain and the sound of waves breaking against the rocks. Somewhere beyond the horizon, someone she had never met now owned every piece of her heart she had ever placed on canvas. She wondered what kind of person would want them, what they saw when they looked at those faces that even she didn't understand. The rain returned before dawn. It tapped gently against the glass, and with each drop she thought of those initials, of the faceless buyer who seemed to know her better than she knew herself. Sleep eluded her, and when she finally rose, her reflection in the mirror startled her. Eyes wide, skin pale, as though she had spent the night listening for something just beyond hearing. At the gallery the next day, the walls were empty. The absence of her paintings made the room feel colder, as though the ghosts she had painted had all walked away. Mr. Hollis offered congratulations, but his voice was cautious and certain. "It's good news, isn't it?" he asked. She forced a smile, nodding, though her chest ached with unease. She walked home beneath an overcast sky, clutching her coat close as the wind pressed against her. Every shop she passed seemed quieter than usual, every familiar face distant. When she reached the cliffs overlooking the harbor, she stopped and let the sea spray sting her cheeks. Somewhere across the water, someone was looking at her art, at him, and she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed in ways she could not yet see. That evening, she lit a single candle in her studio. Its flame flickered against the window pane, reflecting back two figures, herself and the painted man behind her on the canvas. She stepped closer, tracing the faint brushstrokes that formed his eyes. They seemed almost alive in the dim light, filled with the kind of sadness that only memory could hold. She whispered to the empty room, "Oh, why you?" But the only answer was the sound of the sea below, whispering against the rocks. She thought of the initials again, ER, and wrote them on a scrap of paper, tucking it into her sketchbook as if keeping a secret. Outside, the storm returned with sudden force, wind howling through the narrow streets, rain battering the glass until the candle nearly went out. She sat beside it, her hair damp, her hands clasped together as if in prayer. Somewhere, she imagined, her paintings hung in another room, each one a window, each one a reminder of something unfinished between them. Far from Whitestone Harbor, in a dimly lit apartment lined with her art, a man stood silently before those very canvases. The flicker of city lights touched his face, the same face she had painted again and again. His hand brushed the surface of one portrait, his expression unreadable. "You never stopped seeing me," he whispered, voice barely more than breath. His eyes lingered on the painted version of himself, and the corner of his mouth curved into a shadow of sorrow. "Even when you forgot." He turned off the light, leaving the room bathed in darkness and moonlight reflected off the rain. For a long time he stood there, surrounded by every piece she had ever made, listening to the silence as though it might answer him. Then, almost gently, he said her name, Evelyn. The sound of it seemed to stir the air, as if the world itself had been waiting to hear it again. The city was loud that night, but inside Adrian Rowe's penthouse there was only the hum of silence. Rain streaked the tall windows, soft and rhythmic, just like the sea she painted. He stood before the wall of canvases, her canvases, each one filled with the same face, his face painted through her eyes. He'd watched her evolve without knowing him, seen her sadness deepen, her colors shift from light to storm. Every brushstroke felt like a confession, every shade of blue a memory of what they had lost. He'd promised himself he would never see her again. Not after the accident, not after the day she woke in the hospital with his name erased from her world. He had walked away that night because she needed peace, not the man who carried the weight of their past. But fate had its own quiet cruelty. 2 years later, he had seen one of her paintings in a small exhibit by chance, his own reflection staring back at him from her art. It had felt like being seen by a ghost. Adrian brushed his fingers against one of the portraits, the paint rough beneath his touch. "You still see me," he whispered, "even when you shouldn't." His life since her had been made of restraint, measured days, controlled silences, the routine of a man afraid to feel again. Yet, every time a new piece appeared in that gallery, he felt himself unraveling a little more. He told himself he was protecting her by staying hidden, but the truth was simpler. He couldn't bear the thought of her painting someone else's face. He had been buying her work under his initials, AR, careful to leave no trace. He told himself it was for preservation, that no one else should own what she created. But when he looked at them now, he realized they weren't his to keep. They belonged to the love she had forgotten, and the memories he couldn't let go of. The irony stung. She had forgotten, yet she remembered him more truthfully than he remembered himself. Miles away, Evelyn awoke in the pale light before dawn, the echo of a dream fading from her chest. She had seen him again, the same man from her paintings, standing in the rain, his face turned toward her as if calling her name. She pressed her palms to her eyes, heart racing. It felt too real to be just imagination. She rose and crossed her studio, staring at the canvas she had finished last night. His eyes, familiar and distant, looked back at her, filled with unspoken sorrow. For the first time, she wondered if her art wasn't simply invention but memory. She tried to shake the thought away, but it lingered. Who was he? Why did he feel so close? And why did her chest ache when she painted him, as though her body remembered pain her mind refused to name? Later that day, she visited the gallery, drawn by curiosity she couldn't explain. Mr. Hollis greeted her with a nervous smile. "He bought the new one," he said. Evelyn froze. "Already?" "Yes. He sent word this morning. Same initials." AR, she felt the same uneasy flutter beneath her ribs, the mix of gratitude and fear. Someone out there was watching her life unfold on canvas, and she didn't even know his face. That evening, she tried to paint again, but her hand refused to move. Instead, she found herself walking down to the harbor, the fog curling low across the shore. The tide murmured against the rocks, whispering like a secret too old to be spoken aloud. She watched the waves and thought of the stranger who seemed to know her better than she knew herself. In the city, Adrian sat at his desk, pen hovering over a letter he couldn't finish. He'd written a dozen versions before, all of them ending the same way, unsent. He wanted to tell her the truth, that he had once loved her more than anything, that she had saved him long before she even knew it. But he feared the weight of his presence would crush what little piece she had rebuilt. His eyes lingered on the unfinished line. You paint what the world forgets. He folded it carefully and placed it in an envelope he knew would never reach her. Days passed. Evelyn returned to her studio, restless and sleepless, haunted by the same eyes that watched her from every canvas. She tried painting other things, flowers, sunlight, the sea, but somehow his image returned unbidden, inevitable. She felt both possessed and protected by it. Late one night, when the wind rattled her window, she found an envelope slipped beneath the door. Her name was written in clean, elegant handwriting. Inside was a small piece of paper, blank except for one line. Some faces return when love is unfinished. She stared at the words until they blurred. It couldn't be from anyone in town. No one here even knew about her painting's subject. Her heartbeat quickened. Who would send such a message? And why did it sound like something she'd once said herself? Across the miles, Adrian watched the same rain that fell over Whitestone Harbor sweep through his window. He had sent the letter, though he'd sworn he wouldn't. The moment he'd sealed it, guilt had bloomed in his chest, but so had something else. Hope. He told himself it was harmless, that it would only make her think, not remember. But a part of him knew that memory had its own will. Evelyn couldn't sleep that night. The letter lay open beside her bed, the ink glimmering faintly in the candlelight. She turned toward her easel, drawn as if by instinct. Before she knew it, her hand had found the brush again. The strokes came easier this time. Gentle, certain, alive. Certain alive. She painted until dawn, and when she stepped back, the air caught in her throat. The man on the canvas was no longer a stranger. His eyes were the same ones she saw in her dreams, his face softened by sorrow and longing. It felt less like a creation and more like a memory finally surfacing. Far away, Adrian rose from his desk, restless, the night heavy with silence. Something deep inside him stirred, the faint, inexplicable feeling that she was painting again, that somewhere her brush was calling his name without words. He looked once more at her paintings surrounding him, their faces shimmering in the dim light, and whispered into the dark, soon. Outside, the storm gathered strength. In Whitestone Harbor, Evelyn's candle flickered, threatening to go out. The first drop of rain struck her window, echoing like a heartbeat against the glass. She glanced at the finished painting once more, her voice breaking into a whisper she didn't understand. Why do I feel like I've lost you before? The question lingered in the quiet room, unanswered, as if even the air held its breath. The rain returned 3 days later, heavier than before, drumming against rooftops and cobblestones until the entire harbor seemed to pulse with its rhythm. The town blurred into shades of gray and silver, the world wrapped in a kind of soft, melancholic quiet. Evelyn walked through it with her coat drawn tight, her thoughts tangled in the mystery of the letter she had found. The words haunted her. Some faces return when love is unfinished. Return when love is unfinished. She repeated them under her breath, as if the meaning might change, but it never did. They felt like a message from the past, written by someone who knew her better than she knew herself. She made her way toward the little cafe that sat on the corner of the main street, the one with fogged windows and the comforting scent of cinnamon and coffee. She needed to think, to breathe, to feel less haunted by her own imagination. As she stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed softly, announcing her to a room half filled with rain, damp patrons seeking warmth. She found a seat near the window where droplets clung like trembling glass beads and ordered tea. When she looked up, she saw him. He sat alone at the table across from hers, a notebook open in front of him, a pencil balanced between long, quiet fingers. His hair was dark, slightly wet from the rain, and the collar of his coat was turned up against the chill. He looked up briefly, and for the smallest moment, their eyes met. Evelyn froze. Her breath caught before she even understood why. The recognition was instant, irrational, terrifying. He looked away first, returning to the pages before him as though nothing had passed between them. But her pulse refused to settle. The stranger's profile was sharp and familiar, like the shape of a word she had once spoken too many times. His presence felt impossible, and yet he was there, flesh and breath and silence. Her tea arrived and she tried to focus on the steam rising from the cup, but the soft scratch of his pencil against paper pulled her back. Without meaning to, her gaze followed the movement of his hand. He wasn't writing, he was sketching, and as he turned a page, she saw faint lines forming something achingly familiar. Her face, her eyes, captured in delicate graphite, as if drawn from memory. She couldn't move. The sound of rain filled the spaces between them, a steady heartbeat that neither could ignore. When she finally found her voice, it came out quieter than she intended. That drawing, he looked up again, his eyes the same soft gray as the sea beyond the harbor. "I'm sorry," he said almost shyly. "You were sitting there, and the light—" But she cut him off with a shake of her head. "No, it's not that. It's just strange. You draw like you've known me." For a long moment he studied her, as though weighing what truth to give. Then, with a faint, wistful smile, he said, "Maybe I have." She didn't know what to say. Something inside her stirred at his tone, a quiet familiarity that didn't belong to the present. She forced a small laugh, the kind that hides confusion. "That's an odd thing to say to a stranger." He smiled, but there was sorrow behind it. "Strange things have a way of finding me." When he introduced himself, his name felt like a secret she should have already known. "Adrian," he said softly. Adrian Rowe. The initials hit her like a tremor. A.R., and for a heartbeat, she forgot how to breathe. He didn't seem to notice, only closed his sketchbook gently, as though sealing something private inside. The conversation between them moved carefully after that, the kind that unfolded slowly, each word cautious and tender. They spoke of art, of the sea, of how rain had a way of making everything feel suspended between worlds. He asked what she painted, and she hesitated before answering. "People," she said finally, "of faces I don't know but feel like I should." He nodded, his gaze distant. "Maybe they're waiting for you to remember them." The words struck something deep inside her, though she didn't understand why. There was something in the way he spoke, quiet, deliberate, as if each word had lived a life before leaving his mouth. She wanted to ask him more, but before she could, his phone vibrated on the table. He glanced at the screen, expression unreadable, then stood. "I should go," he said, slipping the sketchbook into his coat. "But may I leave something with you?" Before she could answer, he tore a page from the book, folded it once and set it on her table. Then, with a nod and a brief smile that didn't reach his eyes, he left. The bell chimed softly behind him, and the door closed with the hush of falling rain. Evelyn sat frozen for a long time, the folded page untouched between her fingers. Outside, his figure disappeared into the blur of gray streets, swallowed by the mist. When she finally unfolded the page, her breath hitched. It wasn't the sketch of her face she had seen earlier. It was a portrait of the same man she had been painting for months. The same face, the same eyes. Her heartbeat quickened. This couldn't be coincidence. The paper trembled in her hand as she whispered his name again, tasting the letters like something half-remembered. Adrian Rowe. That night, back in her studio, she placed the drawing beside her latest painting. The man in the rain. They were identical. The same sadness, the same gaze. She stood there for a long time, the storm echoing outside, the wind against the windows whispering like a voice she once knew. Across the city, Adrian stood by his window, rain streaking the glass, the ghost of her voice still in his ears. He hadn't planned to see her, hadn't planned for her to look at him that way. He had promised himself distance, anonymity. But one moment in that cafe had undone every wall he had built. He closed his eyes, exhaling a tremor that was part pain, part relief. "You saw me," he murmured. "After all this time, you finally saw me." The rain deepened outside, a quiet witness to two hearts circling the edge of a truth neither was ready to face. Evelyn didn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face, the man from her dreams, the man from her paintings, and now, impossibly, the man from the cafe. Adrian Rowe. The name echoed through her thoughts like a forgotten melody, stirring something deep and unsteady within her. She kept staring at the drawing he had left behind, her fingers brushing the edge of the page as if it might dissolve under her touch. The resemblance was undeniable. It wasn't inspiration or coincidence. It was truth, buried somewhere between her heart and her memory. By dawn, her studio was filled with the pale blue light of a sky just beginning to wake. The rain had quieted, leaving behind the soft hiss of the sea beyond the cliffs. Evelyn stood before a blank canvas, brush in hand. unsure what she was trying to capture. She didn't plan the first stroke. It simply appeared, as if guided by something outside herself. Then another, and another. Before she realized it, she was painting him again, not as the mysterious stranger or the dreamlike figure who haunted her sleep, but as he had been in the cafe, real, human, vulnerable. His eyes carried the same grief she had seen in her own reflection, yet as the portrait took form, she noticed something different this time. There was pain in it, yes, but also tenderness, the quiet ache of recognition. When she stepped back hours later, her pulse quickened. The man on the canvas looked alive, as if he might turn his head and speak her name. She covered her mouth with her hand, trembling. "Oh, what are you trying to tell me? No, what are you trying to tell me?" she whispered to the painted face. The silence offered no answer, only the soft creak of the house settling against the morning wind. That afternoon, Mr. Hollis arrived at her door. His shoes were still wet from the rain, his hat dripping as he stepped into the small studio. "You've been busy again," he said with a smile, but it faded the moment he saw the new painting. "Good heavens, Evelyn." She turned toward him, uncertain. "What is it?" He walked closer, his expression caught between admiration and unease. "It's remarkable. I've never seen you paint like this." "There's life in it." He hesitated, lowering his voice. "The same man, isn't it? The one who keeps buying your work?" Her heart stuttered. "How do you know it's the same man?" "Because he came by the gallery again this morning," Hollis said. "He asked if you had anything new. I told him you hadn't delivered in weeks. But he left this." He handed her a small card with neat handwriting, AR, and a single request beneath it. "I want the next one." Evelyn's breath hitched. Her eyes fell back to the portrait. The idea of him owning it, the most intimate thing she had ever painted, felt unbearable. "No," she said firmly. "This one's not for sale." Hollis blinked. "Evelyn, he's your best buyer. You can't just—" "I don't care," she interrupted. "This one stays with me." For the first time, she saw confusion cross his features. "All right," he said finally, tucking the card away. "But if he asks again, what should I tell him?" She hesitated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Tell him some things aren't meant to be bought." After he left, the house felt impossibly still. Evelyn sat before the portrait, tracing the line of his jaw with the back of her finger, as if trying to understand what connection bound them. The air felt charged, restless. She turned toward the window, the gray horizon mirroring her uncertainty. Somewhere, he was looking for this piece of her heart on canvas, and she couldn't shake the feeling that by refusing to sell it, she had just broken an unspoken thread between them. In the city, Adrian stood in his dimly lit studio, the sound of rain returning against the glass. He had waited all morning for word from Hollis. When the call finally came, the answer was not what he expected. She refused. The words hit harder than they should have. For a long time, he said nothing. Then he moved toward the nearest canvas, the one she had painted months ago, before they met again. He stared at it, at the softness in her brushwork. The way she had always seen him, not as he was, but as he wished to be. He closed his eyes and let out a slow, trembling breath. "She's remembering," he whispered. He could feel it, the shift in her art, the tremor in the way she looked at him at the cafe. The distance he had carefully maintained was crumbling, and he didn't know if he should let it. He'd wanted to protect her from the truth, from the pain that had once broken them both. But now that she was painting him with such familiarity, he wondered if the past was coming for them, whether he was ready or not. The next evening, Evelyn found another letter slipped under her door. This one had no name, only a single line written in the same steady hand. "You paint what you remember, not what you imagine." Her chest tightened as she read it over and over. Was it him? Had Adrian been the one sending these all along? And if he was, what was it she was supposed to remember? She stepped outside, clutching the letter as the last traces of daylight faded into mist. The sea below roared softly, steady as breath. In her studio, the candlelight flickered across the portrait's face, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw his eyes glisten with something like life. She blinked, startled, stepping back. Her heart pounded, the letter still trembling in her hand. Somewhere beyond the rain and distance, Adrian stood by his window again, looking toward the unseen coastline. His reflection merged with the city lights, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to whisper the truth that had lived quietly in his chest. "I never stopped loving you." The storm gathered outside, thunder rolling low and distant as if the sky itself could feel the weight of the secret they were both circling. The truth that one was painting to remember, and the other was hiding to forget. The following morning, the rain had stilled, leaving behind a fragile calm that seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table, the letter from the night before resting beside her untouched cup of tea. The words blurred each time she read them. You paint what you remember, not what you imagine. They shouldn't have meant anything, but they did. Something about the phrasing felt achingly familiar, like a phrase whispered once long ago in a place she could no longer reach. She tried to shake the thought away, to return to her brushes and paints, but the feeling followed her like a ghost. Each stroke of color brought fragments to the surface, a hand reaching through water, the faint sound of laughter, a voice calling her name through fog. She dropped her brush, her breath trembling. It was too much. The memory hovered just beyond her grasp, shimmering and fragile, like light rippling on the sea. For days, she avoided the studio, hoping distance might bring clarity. But one evening, as the sky deepened to indigo, she returned to find another envelope slipped under her door. The handwriting was the same, elegant and deliberate. Inside was a single phrase, written in black ink. Some promises never drown. Her pulse quickened. That word, drown, sent a chill through her. She couldn't remember why, but it stirred something dark and buried, an echo of water rushing, of fear, of a scream swallowed by the sea. She pressed the paper to her chest, trying to steady her breathing. Someone knew her deeply enough to touch the pieces of a past she herself couldn't see. The next morning, she walked into the gallery with the letter hidden in her coat pocket. Mr. Hollis looked up from his desk, startled to see her so pale. "Evelyn, you all right? You look as if you've seen a ghosty. Oh. She forced a small smile. Have there been any messages? From him? Or from your buyer?" He frowned, searching through a stack of papers. "Not since last week." "Why?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "To nothing. Never mind." But as she turned to leave, he called after her. "Evelyn, that man, he's different. He's not like the others who come through here. There's something." He stopped, searching for the word. "Careful about him, like he's guarding something." Her heart stumbled. Guarding what? Hollis shrugged helplessly. "It may be you." She left without another word, the weight of his comment pressing against her chest. Outside Whitestone Harbor was drenched in silver light, the gulls circling lazily above the docks. Every corner seemed to whisper of unseen eyes, of someone watching from the mist. Back in the city, Adrian sat at his desk, surrounded by her paintings. The newest portrait, the one she had refused to sell, lingered in his thoughts like an unanswered question. He had sent the letters knowing he shouldn't, knowing each word would stir what time had tried to bury, but he couldn't help himself. Every message was a way of reaching for her without breaking his vow to stay away. He'd kept his distance for her sake, believing her peace mattered more than his longing. Yet seeing her again at the cafe had undone him. The light in her eyes, the same one that once pulled him from the edge, was still there. She didn't remember him, but she painted him from memory, all the same. He unfolded the sketch he'd made of her that day, tracing the faint lines with his thumb. There was gentleness in the way she'd looked at him, but also confusion. He knew that if she remembered everything, the accident, the night by the bridge, the promise, she might never forgive him for leaving. But hiding the truth was a cruelty of its own. That evening, Evelyn sat on her porch, the sea whispering below. She had lit a candle beside her, its flame bending gently with the wind. Her gaze drifted to the path leading down to the harbor, half expecting to see a shadow moving there, a figure waiting in the rain. Nothing. Only silence? Then she noticed another envelope wedged beneath the doorframe. Her heart raced as she picked it up, fingers trembling. Inside, another line awaited her. "You once told me art was how we keep love alive." She froze. That sentence, it wasn't just familiar, it was hers. She could almost hear herself saying it. Her own voice carried on laughter and sunlight. The memory hit her like a wave. She saw a boy standing beside her by the water's edge, sketching her as the tide came in. His hair was damp from rain, his eyes bright and kind. She remembered his voice, low and certain, saying he'd never let her fade. And then, nothing. The image shattered, replaced by cold and the sound of rushing water. She stumbled back, clutching the letter. "Who are you?" she whispered into the quiet, her voice trembling. "Why do you know my words?" Far away, Adrian stood at his window, his reflection blurred by the drizzle in the glass. He could almost feel her confusion, the pieces of memory shifting inside her. He knew it was only a matter of time before she remembered the truth, before the tide of what they'd lost returned in full. And when it did, she would hate him for what he'd done. but love has its own kind of cruelty. He picked up his pen once more and began another note, slower this time, the words carved out of hesitation and ache. When you remember, don't be afraid. I never stopped watching the horizon. By morning, the letter was already on its way to Whitestone Harbor. Evelyn woke to find it waiting at her door, the paper damp from mist, the ink slightly blurred at the edges. She read it over and over until her hands shook. For the first time, she didn't feel afraid of the voice behind the letters. She felt drawn, pulled by a thread that led backward through time toward something she had once lost. That night, she stood before the portrait she had refused to sell, the one of him. Her eyes stung with tears she couldn't explain. "If you're real," she whispered to the painted face, "if I've known you before, then come back." Outside, the wind rose again, carrying the scent of rain, and somewhere beyond the harbor, in a city drowned in silence, Adrian closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness, "I already have." Winter came quietly to Whitestone Harbor, dressing the world in muted tones of gray and white. The waves grew slower, the wind colder, and the silence deeper. Evelyn's days blurred into one another, the only sound in her small cottage the faint scratch of her brush against canvas. She hadn't received another letter in a week, yet the echo of the last one still haunted her. "When you remember, don't be afraid." I never stopped watching the horizon. It lingered in her mind like a secret she was on the edge of rediscovering. Each morning, she walked to the edge of town, past the frozen fields and down to the narrow bridge that crossed the ravine near the cliffs. The wood creaked beneath her boots, the river below half frozen, whispering through gaps in the ice. She didn't know why she came here. It wasn't on her usual path. But something about the bridge drew her, like the pull of a forgotten dream. Each time she would stand in the middle, look out over the white expanse, and feel her heart tighten with the strange, painful certainty that something important had once happened there. One evening, just as the light began to fade, she brought her sketchbook with her. The cold bit at her fingers as she drew, tracing the outline of the bridge, the curve of the water below, the faint silhouette of someone standing at the far end, someone she couldn't quite see. She blinked, and the image shifted. The figure vanished, leaving only snow and silence. Her breath came out uneven, visible in the frigid air. She didn't know if she was imagining things or remembering. Back in her studio that night, she began painting again, this time the bridge itself. The canvas filled with frost and shadow, with a pale sky heavy with snow. As the scene took shape, she realized she had painted it before, though she couldn't recall when. There was a small figure at the edge of the bridge, looking down into the river. It was a man, and in the reflection below she saw herself. Her hand faltered. "Why does it always come back to you?" She whispered to the portrait on the opposite wall, the one she had refused to sell. His painted eyes seemed to hold the same question, silent and knowing. The next morning brought another envelope, pressed flat against her door. The handwriting was softer this time, almost hesitant. Inside was a single photograph. The edges were worn, faded by time, and in it stood two figures on that same bridge. Her and a man she couldn't quite recognize, his arm draped protectively over her shoulders. The image was old, the kind of photo that had lived too long in someone's pocket. On the back, a message written in the same elegant script. "You promised to wait for spring." Evelyn's knees weakened. The photograph slipped from her fingers and drifted onto the floor. She pressed her palms against her face, shaking. Her mind tried to make sense of what her heart already knew, that this wasn't chance, that the man she had met at the cafe, the man she painted again and again, was the same one from this photograph. But how? And why couldn't she remember him fully? In the city, Adrian sat in his study, the winter light dull and unkind. The last letter had been the hardest to send. He had stared at that photograph for hours before letting it go, knowing what it would awaken. He could still feel the cold of that bridge beneath his hands, the way her laughter had echoed across the water the day everything changed. They had been young, too certain that love alone could conquer everything. But when the accident came, when the car slipped from the road into the river below, he had watched her fall into the dark, had pulled her out himself, her breath gone, her memory shattered. He had stayed by her side in the hospital until she awoke, only to see her eyes filled with confusion, her voice asking who he was. The doctors told him she had lost the last few years, that it was best she start anew, without the burden of remembering what nearly took her life. So he left. He left because she deserved peace, but seeing her again had changed everything. The way she looked at him that day in the cafe. It wasn't empty. It was recognition struggling to surface. Now, as he stared at the snow outside, he knew he couldn't stay hidden much longer. Evelyn spent the next few days wandering between her studio and the bridge, drawn as though following invisible footsteps. The photo never left her coat pocket. Sometimes she caught flashes of memory, the glint of sunlight on water, his voice promising to find her again if they ever lost each other. Days. She had thought they were just dreams, but they were pieces of something real. One evening, as twilight spilled across the harbor, she crossed the bridge once more. The air smelled of salt and frost, her breath curling in front of her like smoke. At the center she paused, running her fingers along the railing. A faint sound reached her through the snow, a man's voice low and close. "You always used to hum when it snowed." She turned sharply. Adrian stood at the other end of the bridge, his dark coat dusted with flakes, his eyes fixed on hers. For a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He looked exactly as she had painted him. Older, sadder, but real. "Evelyn," he said softly, taking a careful step closer. "We didn't mean for it to happen this way." Her voice trembled. "You're the one who's been sending the letters." He nodded once, the weight of it in his eyes. "I thought if I gave you the pieces, you might remember on your own." The wind rose between them, carrying snow across the bridge like drifting ash. "Why me?" she asked, her heart pounding. "Why do I keep painting you?" "Because," he said, his breath clouding the air, "you never stopped loving me. You just forgot how. You just forgot how." The silence that followed was fragile, trembling with everything they couldn't yet say. Evelyn stared at him, her mind spinning, her heart remembering what her memory could not. And in that stillness, she knew this was not an ending, but the beginning of something that had been waiting too long to return. The snow thickened around them, falling softly over the bridge where once, long ago, love had been lost to the river below. The snow fell harder after that night on the bridge, as though the sky itself had chosen to keep their meeting secret beneath its white silence. Evelyn could still feel the echo of his voice, the way he had said her name like it was both a prayer and an apology. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw him standing there against the gray twilight, the cold air turning his breath to mist, his eyes full of things she couldn't yet understand. But when she woke the next morning, the world felt different, thicker somehow, like time had slowed. She couldn't tell if what happened on the bridge had been real or a dream woven from her longing. The frost on her window shimmered in soft patterns, reminding her of the snow that had clung to his coat, the way he had looked at her, hesitant, reverent, as if afraid she might vanish. She wrapped her shawl tighter and stared out across the harbor. The sea was pale and restless, whispering beneath the ice. It was the same sound she remembered hearing in fragments of her dreams. The brush slipped uselessly in her hand, every color she tried turning dull beneath her fingertips. She kept thinking of what he had said on the bridge. "You never stopped loving me. You just forgot how." And the words had haunted her through the night. She didn't know whether to believe them, yet something deep inside her trembled with recognition. As evening came, she found herself drawn once again to the bridge. The snow was thinner now, the wind sharp. She walked slowly, her breath clouding before her. Halfway across, she stopped and closed her eyes. The air carried faint sounds, the creak of the old boards, the whisper of the sea below, and something else. A voice. Low, almost swallowed by the wind, but unmistakable. "Evelyn." Her heart leapt. She turned sharply, but there was no one there. Only the long stretch of white and shadow. She tried to tell herself it was just the wind, yet her body knew better. That voice. It had been the same one that had spoken her name long before she knew it belonged to him. She stepped closer to the railing, gripping it tightly. The river below moved slowly, dark and glassy. For a moment, the reflection shimmered strangely, and she thought she saw two figures instead of one, herself and another, standing beside her. She blinked, and it was gone. But the feeling remained. He was close, even when unseen. That night she dreamed again. She was standing on the same bridge, but the snow had turned to rain. The world was washed in silver, and she could feel warmth beside her, a hand brushing against hers, fingers intertwining. When she looked up, she saw his face. Adrian, younger, laughing, alive with sunlight instead of sorrow. He leaned in, his voice soft in her ear. Promise me you'll never forget." The dream shifted then. The laughter faded. The water below roared louder, the planks beneath her feet trembling. She felt the world tilt, a scream caught in her throat. Adrian's hand reached for her, desperate, his eyes filled with terror as the river swallowed her reflection whole. She woke gasping, her skin damp with sweat, her pulse racing like she'd fallen all over again. When morning came, the storm had broken. The light was sharp and pale, cutting through the fog. She moved through the house like a ghost, her mind still half in the dream. The details clung to her, the bridge, the fall, the sound of his voice screaming her name. It wasn't just imagination, it was memory. Later, when she returned to her studio, she noticed something strange. The portrait of Adrian, the one she had painted and refused to sell, wasn't where she had left it. It had fallen forward onto the floor. The frame splintered slightly at one corner. She lifted it carefully, and as she did, something slipped from behind the canvas, a folded letter, yellowed with age, sealed with wax that had long since cracked. Her breath caught. Hands trembling, she opened it. The handwriting was faint but unmistakable. It was his. "Evelyn, if you ever find this, it means I did what I promised. You won't remember me, not for a while, but your art will. You'll paint me again and again until the day your heart recognizes what your mind has forgotten. When that happens, come to the bridge. I'll be there, waiting where we left everything unfinished." The paper slipped from her hand, fluttering to the floor like a fallen leaf. She stood frozen, the sound of her heartbeat filling the quiet. He had known. He had known she would lose him, known she would forget. And still he had waited. In the city, Adrian sat in his studio, his eyes fixed on the painting of her he had never shown anyone, the one he had painted years ago after she forgot him. Her face was peaceful, untouched by pain, surrounded by light. He had promised himself he would never disturb her world again. But that promise had begun to crumble the night she looked at him in the cafe, and nearly remembered. He rose, walked to the window, and watched the snowdrift across the streets below. Somewhere far beyond the city lights, she was holding the letter. He could feel it, the fragile thread between them tightening once more. He whispered her name into the cold glass, his reflection fading into the storm. Evelyn. Back in Whitestone Harbor, she heard it again. The whisper. Close this time, not in her head, but in the air around her. She spun toward the studio door, her heart hammering. But there was only darkness and the sound of rain returning. The candle flickered wildly beside the fallen letter, casting shadows that danced across the walls, shapes that looked like him. She pressed her palms to her chest, whispering into the stillness. Why do I feel like I've lived this before? Outside, the wind rose and carried her question out over the sea. And though she didn't see him somewhere beyond the horizon, Adrian closed his eyes and whispered the same words back to her. Because you have. Evelyn didn't leave her studio for 2 days after finding the letter. The words had rooted themselves in her chest, growing heavier with each passing hour. You won't remember me, not for a while, but your art will. She read them again and again, tracing the faint pressure of his handwriting as if the memory of him might rise through the paper. The edges smelled faintly of salt and turpentine, like something that had belonged to both of them. Everywhere she looked, he was there, in the brushstrokes, in the shadows of her paintings, in the way the light lingered against the walls. Even the silence seemed to hum with the memory of his voice. It was no longer a question of if he had been part of her life. She knew now, deep in her bones, that he had. What she didn't understand was why she had forgotten, or why he had chosen to return only through letters and ghosts. On the third morning, unable to bear the walls any longer, she packed her bag and left Whitestone. The decision came without thought, like instinct. The train carried her north toward the city, the same direction her paintings had always vanished to. The journey felt both new and familiar, the rhythm of the wheels like the ticking of a clock long stopped. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. She only carried the letter, the photograph, and one thought that pulsed in her mind. He said he'd be waiting. The city greeted her with pale light and noise. It was strange and vast, yet as she walked through its streets, something in her remembered. The angles of the buildings, the faint scent of coffee near a corner cafe, the sound of rain against cobblestone. It was as though she had once lived a life here she couldn't quite touch. She wandered until dusk, until the lamps flickered on one by one, washing the sidewalks in gold. Then, just as she began to question what she was even searching for, she saw it. A small gallery on a quiet street. Its windows were dimly lit. Curtains half drawn, but she could see the edge of a painting inside. The unmistakable hue of her own palette. Her pulse stumbled. The sign above the door read simply, Rose Studio. Her breath caught. The name felt like a door swinging open inside her. She pushed through the entrance before she could think. The smell hit her first. Eel paint, varnish, and time. The lights were low, warm, and gentle. The sound of her footsteps echoed against the wooden floor, and then she saw them. Every wall was covered in her art. Her knees weakened. There were dozens of canvases, maybe more, each one carefully framed, arranged in order like chapters of a life she hadn't realized she'd been painting. Early pieces with trembling brushstrokes, later works where her colors had grown bolder, her emotion deeper, and always, always, his face. Adrian. The versions of him changed as the years did. Some were smiling, some somber, some turned half away as though walking into distance. She stepped closer to one, a portrait she had painted long ago without knowing why. Now, standing before it, she remembered. The day, the smell of rain, the way he had leaned over her shoulder to steady her trembling hand. Her fingers grazed the frame and a sound broke from her chest. Half gasp, half sob. "You kept them," she whispered. "All of them." The air stirred behind her. "I couldn't let them go." She turned slowly. Adrian stood in the doorway, framed by the soft light spilling from the hall. He looked tired but calm, his expression a mixture of hope and fear. The sight of him made the world tilt. She had dreamed of this moment 100 times, but never believed it would be real. Evelyn's voice shook. "Why? Why keep them all? Easy. You could have sold them. You could have... I tried," he said softly, stepping closer. "Once. But I couldn't. Every painting was a piece of what we were. You painted what you forgot, and I collected what I couldn't forget." The words struck something deep in her, something fragile and unbearably human. "You knew I'd lost you." He nodded. "I did, and I stayed away because I thought that was mercy. I thought if I disappeared, you could start again without the weight of me." He looked around the room at the hundreds of faces painted in her hand. "But you found me anyway." Her throat tightened. "I didn't even know I was looking." He smiled faintly, sorrow touching the corners of his mouth. "You did. Every brushstroke brought you closer." She turned, her eyes sweeping across the walls once more. So much of her life was here. Years of longing she hadn't understood. Pieces of a love that had survived even when memory had not. The air seemed alive with it, pulsing like a heartbeat. She stepped closer to him, the distance between them filled with unspoken years. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I wanted you to remember on your own," he said. "If I'd forced it, it would have been another wound. I thought maybe the soul remembers what the mind forgets." I was right. Her eyes glistened, the weight of his words sinking into her. "It hurt," she whispered, "not knowing why I painted you, not knowing why I felt so hollow." He reached out slowly, as though afraid she might fade if he moved too fast. His fingers brushed her wrist. "Warm real." "I know," he said. "It hurt for me too." The contact was electric, and in that moment, a flood of memory rushed through her. The bridge, the fall, the hospital, the way he had held her hand as she slipped in and out of consciousness. His voice whispering promises into the dark. "I'll wait for you. I'll find you again. Ithia," she gasped, her knees giving way, and he caught her, holding her close as the tears finally came. "I remember." She breathed against his shoulder. "A god, Adrian, I remember." He closed his eyes, his arms tightening around her. "Then I can stop hiding." For a long time, they stood there in the quiet gallery, surrounded by the echoes of their lost years. Outside, the city moved on, unaware that two hearts had finally found their way back through time and silence. When Evelyn finally pulled back, her gaze moved over the paintings again. "They're beautiful," she said softly. "But they're all the past." He smiled gently. "Then let's paint something new." In the days that followed their reunion, the air between Evelyn and Adrian shifted in ways that words couldn't capture. It wasn't the rush of lovers rediscovered, nor the easy comfort of old familiarity. It was fragile, trembling, like sunlight breaking through fog. They spent hours in that gallery together, surrounded by the ghosts of their past, speaking softly as if afraid to wake the memories that still hung between the frames. Yet even in the quiet, something deeper stirred, something that neither of them could quite name. Adrian had begun restoring some of her older works, carefully cleaning the worn edges, retouching the frames. Evelyn often watched him, her brush idle in her hand, trying to memorize the way he moved, the same calm patience she once loved. But beneath the tenderness, there was distance. He smiled often, but his eyes carried a weight she couldn't ignore, as though part of him still lingered somewhere she could not follow. One afternoon, as snow drifted faintly outside the windows, she began a new painting. The first she had attempted since her memory had returned fully. It was supposed to be of him, the man who had waited, the one who had never left her heart. But as the hours passed, her strokes grew sharper, darker. The softness faded, replaced by shadows and smoke. the light behind him dimming into something she didn't understand. When she stepped back, her breath caught. It wasn't Adrian as she knew him now. The man in the painting looked older, haunted, his face drawn, his gaze hollow. His eyes didn't hold love, only guilt. The air around her seemed to thicken. Her pulse quickened, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. She had painted him again, yes, but this time the painting didn't feel like truth, it felt like confession. That evening, when Adrian came to find her, she was still standing before the canvas, her expression unreadable. "It's finished," she said quietly, stepping aside. He approached, curious, but when he saw it, he froze. The color drained from his face. For a long time, he said nothing, his eyes locked on the image. She waited, her chest tight, watching the flicker of recognition cross his features, the way his hand trembled slightly at his side. "What is this?" she whispered. "Why does it feel like something I wasn't meant to paint?" He looked at her then, and the sadness in his eyes was unbearable. "Because it isn't me now," he said slowly. "It's me from after." "After what?" He turned away, pacing toward the far wall where her older works hung. His voice came low, rough. "After you forgot me. After the accident. I tried to move on, Evelyn. I tried to build a life that didn't circle around your absence, but I couldn't. Every day I saw you in strangers' faces, in every shade of blue I mixed on a canvas. The paintings you never knew you painted. They kept me alive, and they broke me." He stopped, his back to her. "You painted what I was, but not what I became." She stared at the painting again, the hollowness in his eyes, the heaviness of loss. It wasn't just art. It was his truth staring back at both of them. "You were in pain," she murmured. He nodded, his voice faint. "You were gone, and I kept waiting for something that would never return. Until one day, I realized I was waiting for a memory, not a person. So I stopped painting. I stopped everything." "And then why did you come back?" she asked, the question breaking out like a whisper of fear. "Because," he said, turning toward her, "you started painting again. And when I saw that first portrait of me, the one with the rain on my shoulders, I knew you were remembering. I thought maybe I could find you again without taking away your peace. But peace isn't what you painted, is it?" Her throat tightened, words trapped beneath the rush of emotion. The emotion. "No," she whispered. "I painted longing. I painted loss." He smiled faintly, stepping closer. "And now you've painted truth." For a long while they stood in silence, the snow outside reflecting through the window, casting ghostly light across the gallery walls. Evelyn could feel the storm gathering inside her chest, the weight of everything they had both endured pressing between them. She reached out, brushing her fingertips against his sleeve. "You hid this part from me," she said softly. "All these years you carried it alone." He shook his head. "I didn't hide it. I just didn't want you to see me like that, broken and bitter. You remembered the man who loved you, not the one who lost you. I wanted to be that version again, even if only for a little while." Her voice trembled. And now, he said, meeting her gaze, "you see everything, the truth, the lies, the years between us. Maybe that's what love really is, seeing the whole of someone and still staying." Tears blurred her vision. She stepped closer until their foreheads nearly touched, her voice barely a breath. "And let me paint you again. Not who you were, who you are." He smiled, eyes closing for a moment. "If you do, paint the light too. I've lived in the shadows long enough." She nodded, feeling the warmth of his breath mingle with hers. "Then we'll begin again." That night, long after he had gone, she stood before the painting once more. The figure within it seemed to shift beneath the lamplight, the sorrow softening, the edges blurring. It was still him, but no longer the man defined by grief. The painting no longer lied. It told the whole story. As she cleaned her brushes, the snow outside turned to quiet rain, tapping gently against the windows as if the world itself was learning to forgive. And somewhere across the city, Adrian sat awake, staring at a blank canvas of his own. For the first time in years, he picked up a brush. The color he chose was gold. The morning after the storm, the gallery felt impossibly still. The air smelled of varnish and dust, faint traces of turpentine hanging in the quiet. Evelyn stood alone in the main hall, the light of dawn filtering softly through the tall windows. Around her, every wall shimmered faintly with color and memory. The paintings, her paintings, seemed different now. Not just pieces of art, but fragments of two lives entwined by time, loss, and love. She traced her fingers along the edge of a frame, following the texture of dried paint. Each portrait carried a pulse of its own, an echo of who she was and who he had been. And, As her eyes moved from one to the next, she noticed how the years had told their story without words, how the early paintings glowed with youth and wonder, how the middle ones darkened with grief, and how the last few had begun to lighten again, like dawn reclaiming the sky. But something caught her eye. In the far corner of the room stood a painting she didn't recognize. The frame was older, gilded but tarnished, and the canvas covered in a sheet of linen. She hesitated before stepping closer. When she lifted the cloth away, a chill passed through her. It was a portrait of herself, younger, softer, her hair loose and golden in the light. She was smiling, the kind of unguarded smile she couldn't remember ever having. Her hands were covered in paint, her eyes turned slightly towards something outside the frame. Whoever had painted it had known her intimately, had seen her in moments that no one else ever could have. Evelyn's throat tightened. She recognized the brushwork. It was his. Adrian had painted her. Not from memory, but from life. She reached out and brushed her fingertips over the image, feeling a rush of emotion so sharp it almost hurt. The woman in that portrait had been whole, unbroken by time. She wondered what Adrian must have felt while painting it, whether he had known he was immortalizing a moment that would one day be lost to her. The sound of a door opening behind her broke the silence. "You weren't supposed to find that one yet," Adrian's voice said softly. She turned slowly. He stood by the doorway, the faintest smile on his lips, his hair damp from the snow outside. "You painted me," she said, her voice trembling. He nodded. "The day before the accident." Her heart stuttered. "You knew we were going out that night?" "I knew the roads were bad," he replied. "But you wanted to see the river and the rain. You said the light was perfect." His gaze drifted to the portrait, his expression caught between tenderness and sorrow. "That was the last time I saw you smile like that." The words settled between them, heavy and delicate as falling snow. Evelyn stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I didn't want to rewrite your memories," he said. "You'd lost so much. I thought if you found it again through your art, it would belong to you. Not to what we had, but to who you'd become." Her voice softened. "And now?" He smiled faintly, but his eyes carried that same quiet ache. "Now you remember both." She turned back to the painting, her chest tightening with emotion. "It feels like a stranger," she whispered. "Like I'm looking at someone I used to be." "That's how I felt about you for years," he said. The silence that followed was gentle, filled with the hum of distant traffic and the faint creak of wood beneath their feet. Evelyn looked around at the walls, the faces she'd painted, all of him through different seasons of her forgetting, and then back to the one painting of herself. "You surrounded yourself with what we lost," she murmured. "Every face in this room, every brushstroke. It was your way of holding on." Adrian's voice was quiet but steady. "And every one of them was a way of forgiving myself. I thought if I kept him close, maybe I could keep you alive in some way." She turned to him, her eyes glistening. He looked at her then, not as a ghost of his past, but as the woman standing before him now, alive, imperfect and real. "It's strange," he said softly. "You spent years painting me without knowing why. And I spent years keeping those paintings, afraid to let them go. Maybe love is just that, two people holding on in different ways until time gives them back to each other." Evelyn's throat tightened. "Then what do we do with it now?" He stepped forward, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his breath. "And this is still time giving us them back to each." She frowned slightly. "I'll let it go." He nodded toward the walls. "These paintings, they've been keeping us trapped in what was. Maybe it's time we stop remembering and start living again." The idea struck something deep inside her, something both freeing and terrifying. "You mean destroy them and not destroy," he said gently. "A release." Her gaze swept over the room again, the countless faces of him, of herself, of everything they had endured. It was their history, their pain, their love suspended in color. He was right. To live in the past was to keep bleeding into yesterday. That evening, they worked side by side in silence, removing frames, covering canvases, choosing a few to keep and letting the rest go. By the time the sun sank behind the city, the gallery no longer felt like a shrine. It felt like a beginning. As they stood in the doorway, Evelyn turned to look one last time at the portrait of her younger self, still glowing faintly in the dim light. "She looks happy," she said. Adrian reached for her hand. "So do you." She smiled, the faintest curve of her lips, fragile but true. "Maybe it's because, for the first time, I'm not painting what I lost." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and silent. And as they stepped into the night, the gallery behind them seemed to breathe for the first time in years. Its walls lighter, its ghosts finally at rest. The days that followed were quiet in a way that felt new, not empty, not mournful, but sacred. The gallery no longer carried the weight of the past. The walls, once heavy with faces and memory, now breathed with possibility. Evelyn and Adrian spent their mornings in the pale winter light, sorting through brushes, canvases, and frames, the rhythm of their movements slow and familiar, like the soft cadence of forgiveness. Words were few, but none were needed. Silence itself had become their language. In the evenings, they would walk through the narrow streets of the city, the lamps glowing softly against the snow. Sometimes he would point out the places they used to visit, a corner cafe, a bookshop that still smelled of paper and time, and though she didn't remember those moments clearly, something inside her would respond, as though her heart recognized what her mind could not. One night, as they crossed the bridge near the river, Evelyn paused mid-step. The wind was sharp, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and rain. The water below moved slow and dark, reflecting the scattered city lights. She leaned against the railing, watching it ripple. "I used to dream about this place," she said softly, "before I even remembered you. I would stand here, and there was always this feeling, like someone was waiting on the other side." Adrian stopped beside her, his hands resting gently on the cold railing. "I was," he said. His voice was calm, almost a whisper. "Every year on the same night, I came here. Sometimes I brought flowers. Sometimes I just stood and listened to the river. I told myself that if love meant anything at all, it would find a way to bring you back to me." She looked at him, her breath clouding between them. And it did. He smiled faintly, but there was sadness in it too. It took time. "But yes, you found me again." The silence that followed was long and soft, filled only by the sound of water and wind. Evelyn's fingers brushed against his, tentative, uncertain, as if testing something fragile. He didn't move at first, only turned his hand slightly until their fingers laced together. It was a quiet, steady kind of connection, the kind that didn't demand or question, only existed. When they returned to the studio, she sat at her easel for the first time since clearing the gallery. Blank canvas waited in front of her, untouched. Adrian lingered behind her, watching as she stared at it, her expression unreadable. "I don't know what to paint," she admitted after a while. "Everything I've ever made was about remembering you. Now that I have you here, I don't know where to begin." He stepped closer, his voice low. "And then don't start with me. Start with what's left." "What's left?" He nodded. "The silence, the peace, the part of you that exists beyond all the hurt." She turned slightly toward him, her gaze softening. "You make it sound easy." "It isn't," he said simply. "But that's what makes it real." She looked back at the canvas, at the expanse of white, and for the first time, she didn't feel fear facing it. She dipped her brush in the faintest shade of gold, the color of the morning light that had followed the storm, and began to paint. Not a face, not a memory, but the feeling of quiet itself. Her strokes were slow, deliberate, and when she glanced over her shoulder, she saw Adrian standing still, watching her as though witnessing something sacred. Hours passed like minutes. When she finally put the brush down, the sky outside had turned to twilight. The canvas before her was not a portrait, but an abstraction. Soft colors blending together, pale blues and golds, the faintest trace of white, like air and calm, made visible. It was both everything and nothing, full of silence. Adrian stepped closer, his eyes moving over it with reverence. "It's beautiful," he murmured. She smiled faintly. "It's what it feels like to breathe again." He looked at her then, really looked, at the calm in her eyes, the steadiness in her hands. "You've changed," he said quietly. "So have you," she replied. "You used to speak like a man waiting for something to return. Now you speak like someone who's finally home." He didn't answer, but the warmth in his gaze said everything. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. For a heartbeat, they simply stood there, suspended in that quiet understanding, their past behind them, their future still unwritten. Later, as they sat together near the window, the city lights flickering beyond the glass, Evelyn rested her head against his shoulder. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore. It was alive, breathing, the kind of silence that carried meaning instead of absence. "Do you ever think," she asked softly, "that love changes shape? That sometimes it stops being something you chase and becomes something you live inside? Instead. He thought for a long moment before answering. "Yes," he said. And I think this, right here, is what it becomes when it finally rests. The snow had begun to fall again outside, slow and weightless, each flake melting quietly against the window pane. The candle beside them flickered low, its light soft against their hands where they lay intertwined. Evelyn closed her eyes, her voice barely a whisper. It's strange how silence used to mean distance, and now it feels like love. Adrian smiled, his thumb tracing slow circles against her hand. Maybe it always did, he said. We just had to learn how to listen to it. They sat there until the candle burned out, the room lit only by the glow of the snow. Neither spoke again that night, but neither needed to. Every heartbeat, every breath, every quiet glance said what words could not. That in the calm after years of storms, love had found them not through noise or grand gestures, but through silence that had finally learned to stay. The snow had begun to melt when Evelyn received his note. It wasn't long or poetic, only a few lines written in the same careful hand she had come to recognize by heart. Meet me at the bridge when the sky turns silver. There's something I need to tell you. She read it twice, then folded it gently, her pulse quickening with something she couldn't name. Hope, maybe, or fear, or both. Outside her window, the last traces of winter clung to the ground, the world caught between seasons, just as she and Adrian seemed to be caught between remembering and becoming. By late afternoon, the light had softened to that fleeting color between gold and gray, and she began the walk toward the harbor. The air was cold, but calm, the sea whispering faintly in the distance. She crossed through the narrow streets, her boots crunching on the wet gravel, and as the bridge came into view, a strange calm settled over her. It was the same bridge where her story had once ended, and somehow where it had begun again. Adrian was already there, standing near the center, his hands in his pockets, his coat brushing softly against the wind. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and for a moment, neither spoke. The river beneath them moved slow and heavy, its surface catching the dim light like liquid glass. She stopped a few paces away, her breath visible in the chill air. You found the note, he said softly. I almost didn't, she replied. It slipped under the door. He smiled faintly. It felt right, leaving it that way, like the first time I sent you letters. I thought maybe this one would reach you differently. Her eyes softened. It did. For a long moment, they simply stood in the quiet, the sound of the wind weaving between their words. Then Adrian looked toward the water, his expression unreadable. You remember this place now, don't you? She nodded slowly. I do. The rain. The way the river rose that night. I remember the sound, the crash, the way you called my name. His eyes flickered, and for the first time she saw the shadow of guilt still clinging to him. I couldn't reach you in time, he said quietly. When I pulled you from the river, I thought you were gone. I've lived with that moment for years. Every breath since then felt borrowed. Evelyn took a step closer, the wind catching her hair. Oh, but I didn't die. You saved me. I saved your life, he said. But not your memory. And maybe that was the same as losing you. Her chest tightened. Adrian, you didn't lose me. You gave me back the chance to live, even if I had to find you all over again. He looked at her then, his eyes bright with something raw and unspoken. All those years, he murmured, I told myself you were better off forgetting. That what we had was too heavy to remember. But every time I saw your paintings, I realized you hadn't forgotten me at all. You just remembered differently. Her voice trembled. And now, he hesitated. And now I'm afraid that remembering might hurt you again. That the truth of what happened that night will change how you see me. Evelyn stepped closer until only a breath separated them. The truth already lives inside me, Adrian. Every brushstroke I ever painted was trying to find it. Whatever it is, I can bear it. He stared at her for a moment, as if searching her face for certainty. Then quietly, he said, the crash wasn't an accident. The world seemed to still. The sound of the river faded into silence. Evelyn's breath hitched. What do you mean? He swallowed hard, his voice breaking slightly. Oh, that night we argued. You wanted to drive to the river and I told you it was too dangerous. You said you needed to see the light on the water, that it made you feel alive. I tried to take the wheel from you when the road turned. And the road turned. I thought I was protecting you, but I made you lose control instead. It was my fault. All of it. She stood frozen, the wind cutting through the silence between them. His words settled over her like a second winter. For a long while, she couldn't speak, couldn't think. He lowered his gaze, his voice barely audible. I've carried it for years, Evelyn. Every night, I'd see the headlights in the rain, the sound of glass breaking. I thought if you never remembered, maybe you'd be free. But I wasn't. I couldn't be. She stepped forward then, slow but sure, until her hand reached his. Adrian, she whispered, you didn't steal my life. You saved it. You stayed. You waited. You loved me when I was gone, when I didn't even know you existed. How could I ever hold that against you? His breath faltered, his eyes meeting hers with disbelief. After everything, she said. And because love doesn't erase pain, it carries it. And somehow we carried each other back here. He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping free. When he looked at her again, the weight that had lived in his gaze for years seemed to fade. I thought I'd lost you forever, he whispered. You did, she said gently. But we found our way home again. The river below moved softly, the water glinting beneath the silver dusk. Adrian took her hand fully, their fingers fitting together like they once had, and for the first time in years, neither looked away. The world around them felt suspended. The snow, the water, the wind, everything holding its breath for this quiet kind of redemption. Then, almost without thought, Evelyn leaned in, her forehead resting against his. The cold of the air met the warmth between them, and in that fragile balance the years seemed to dissolve. There were no more accidents to atone for, no lost time left to mourn, only the present, trembling and real. When she finally spoke, her voice was a whisper against his skin. We never finished that promise, she said. The one we made here. He smiled faintly. That we'd find each other again? She nodded, her eyes closing. Oh, we did. The wind carried the words across the water like a benediction. And when they finally kissed, it wasn't the desperate reunion of the lost. It was quiet, steady, like two souls remembering the same story at last. The bridge beneath them creaked softly, and for the first time since that long-ago night, the sound was not of breaking, but of holding. In the days after the bridge, time seemed to slow around them, as if the world itself understood the weight of what had been forgiven. The city began to thaw, and with it, so did the ache that had shadowed them for so long. They returned to the studio quietly, hand in hand, the scent of rain still clinging to their coats. For the first time since she could remember, Evelyn didn't feel haunted by her art. She didn't feel like she was painting to recover something lost. She simply felt whole. Adrian lingered near the window as she prepared her brushes. The late morning light fell gently across the room, catching on the dust motes that drifted through the air like tiny stars. You were really going to paint again? He asked softly, his voice half wonder, half fear. She smiled faintly, her fingers steady as she laid out her colors. It feels different this time, she said. Before, I painted to remember. Now, I want to paint to live. He watched her for a long while, his gaze tender. Then let me stay and watch. The first strokes came slow, deliberate, like testing a heartbeat after a long silence. Get the long silence. She painted him as he was. Not the man from her dreams, not the shadowed reflection of her grief, but the man who had stood on that bridge and told her the truth. His face was older now, lined by years of waiting and loving and forgiving. But his eyes, those quiet, endless eyes, still carried that same soft ache that had once drawn her toward him. As she worked, the studio filled with the hum of soft music and the rustle of brushes against canvas. Hours passed unnoticed. Every so often, he would move behind her, adjusting the folds of his sleeve, or smile when she frowned in concentration. There was peace in the routine of it, in the closeness they no longer had to question. When she finally stepped back, her breath caught. The painting wasn't perfect. No portrait of truth ever was, but it was alive. She had captured something more than likeness. She had captured presence, the light on his skin, the weight in his gaze, the quiet hope of a man who had survived time itself. Adrian stood beside her, silent for a long while. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. You painted me as I am, he said. He said as who I was, and that's all I ever wanted to see, she whispered. He looked at her then, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, an understanding that they had reached the end of a story without truly ending. He turned toward the painting again, his expression soft. What will you call it? She thought for a moment, her gaze drifting toward the window where the light had begun to fade into evening. The final portrait, she said finally, not because it's the last thing I'll ever paint, but because it's the first thing I've finished. He smiled at that, quiet and real. You sound like the woman I used to know. I am, she said, just a little more awake. As the sun dipped below the skyline, the studio grew warm with golden light. She began cleaning her brushes, while he lingered near the canvas, tracing the air above it with reverence. "You know," he said after a while, "when you were gone, when I thought I'd lost you forever, I used to imagine what this would look like. You painting again. Me standing here, watching. It felt like a dream I wasn't supposed to have." She paused, turning toward him. "And now?" He met her gaze, and there was no hesitation in his voice. "Now it feels like we finally woke up." That night, they decided to hang the portrait in the front room of the gallery, the same place where her very first painting had once hung. As they worked side by side, the quiet between them was filled not with absence, but with the simple rhythm of two people who had stopped running from the past. When it was finally in place, Evelyn stepped back, looking at it in the soft lamplight. It didn't feel like a monument or a memory. It felt like a doorway. She turned to him, her voice low. "Do you ever think we were meant to break apart so we could learn how to come back differently?" Differently? Adrian's hand found hers. "I think we were meant to find each other no matter how many times we had to start over." They stood there for a long time, the world outside the windows quiet and still. The reflection of the portrait shimmered faintly in the glass, their faces blending with the painted ones until it was impossible to tell where the art ended and the living began. Later, when the lights were turned off and the gallery was bathed only in the pale glow of the moon, Evelyn lingered for a moment before leaving. She looked once more at the painting and whispered, "For everything we were, and everything we still are." Adrian's arm slipped around her waist. "You're still talking to your art," he murmured, smiling into her hair. She leaned against him. "It always listens." As they stepped out into the night, the air smelled of rain again, faint and clean. The bridge lay in the distance, silver beneath the moonlight, the river calm and endless. The final portrait waited behind them in the quiet gallery, a testament not to what they had lost, but to what they had finally learned to keep. And for the first time, neither of them looked back. The gallery slept beneath the hush of another early morning, its windows faintly silvered by the light of dawn. The city outside was still, its pulse softened by the quiet hour before waking. Adrian stirred in the small room above the studio, where he and Evelyn had begun staying since their reunion in Yisiramiso. He rose before the sun as he often did, unable to shake the old habits of solitude that had lived in him for years. The stillness of the world at that hour was a kind of peace he couldn't quite let go of. He dressed quietly and moved through the half-darkness, his footsteps soft against the wood. When he reached the gallery floor, the scent of paint and linseed oil lingered faintly in the air, familiar and grounding. The painting, the final portrait, hung near the center wall, its colors glowing gently in the dim light. He stopped in front of it, studying her brushwork as though it contained answers he hadn't yet found. She had painted him as he was, and yet every time he looked at it, he saw something else, a reminder that love, once broken, never returned the same. It came back quieter, wiser, carrying both loss and grace in its hands. He sat at the nearby desk and opened the drawer. Inside was a single envelope worn at the edges. It had been there for months, untouched, its seal unbroken. The letter he had written before she remembered him. The one he never sent. His hand hovered over it now, as though the weight of it had grown heavier with time. He had written it the night he thought he would never see her again. The night he watched her from a distance, knowing she no longer knew his face. The handwriting was steady but old, pressed with emotion he barely recognized as his own. He read it silently, each word sinking deeper into the quiet. "Evelyn, if love means letting go, then I've already failed. I told myself I'd move on, that I'd stop haunting your world from afar. But every painting you make pulls me back. You don't remember me, but you paint me as if you do. And that is both my comfort and my punishment. I used to believe that art could outlast grief. Now I think it's how grief survives us. If the years take you far from me, I only hope you never stop painting. Paint until the ache becomes color, until memory turns gentle. Because even if you forget my name, I'll still be there. In every shadow you soften, in every light you chase." He stopped reading there, his throat tightening. The rest of the words blurred under his gaze. For a moment, he wanted to tear it apart, to let it disappear into the past it belonged to. But then he thought of her, of how she had once asked him why he had never written after the accident, why he hadn't fought to make her remember. Maybe this letter was his answer, too late, and yet somehow still necessary. He folded it carefully, the paper soft with age, and slipped it into the pocket of his coat. Upstairs, he could hear the faint sound of her stirring, the rustle of sheets, the creak of floorboards. He smiled faintly, that small, familiar ache in his chest returning. When she came down a few minutes later, her hair still loose from sleep, she found him by the window. "You're awake early again," she murmured, her voice still hushed by dreams. He turned, his expression soft. "I couldn't sleep. The city feels too quiet." "City feels too quiet." She crossed to him and leaned against the frame beside him, their shoulders brushing. "You always liked the quiet." He nodded. "It's where I used to find you." Her eyes flickered toward the letter peeking slightly from his pocket. "What's that?" He hesitated, his fingers instinctively brushing over it. "It's something I wrote a long time ago. Before everything." She smiled gently. "A secret?" He looked down, his breath steady but low. "And not anymore." He handed it to her, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's yours." Evelyn took it, unfolding the paper with care. The words were faint, the ink slightly faded, but she read them in silence, her expression softening as the letter unfolded in her hands. When she finished, she didn't speak right away. The air between them filled with the faint hum of the waking city, the sound of a faraway bell, the whisper of morning traffic. Finally, she looked up at him, her eyes glassy but calm. "You wrote this when I couldn't remember you." "Yes." "And you never sent it." "I couldn't," he said quietly. "It felt wrong to reach for you when you'd already begun again. You deserved peace, not ghosts." Her gaze lingered on the letter before folding it gently. "But you were never a ghost, Adrian. You were the one thing that stayed. Even when I couldn't name you, I painted you because somewhere deep down I still knew." He exhaled softly, as if the years he'd carried were finally letting go. "And maybe love doesn't die," he said. "And maybe it just waits for us to be ready to see it again." Then Evelyn stepped closer, sliding her hand into his. "Then I think we're finally ready." The morning light spilled across the floor, warm and golden, catching the edges of the final portrait. She moved toward it, holding the letter beside the frame, her voice barely a whisper. "Can I keep it here?" He nodded. "It belongs with the others." She slipped the letter behind the canvas, resting it gently between the frame and the wall. "So it won't be lost again," she said. He watched her in silence, the tenderness in her movements undoing him. When she turned back, he was smiling, his eyes glimmering with quiet joy. "You've turned every wound into something beautiful," he said. "Even the words I never meant for you to read." She brushed her hand against his cheek, her thumb tracing the faint stubble there. "You taught me that love isn't about what's said, it's about what's kept." They stood there for a long time, the world beyond the windows awakening slowly. Outside, the snow had melted completely, replaced by the soft murmur of spring. A breeze slipped through the cracked window, stirring the curtains, carrying the faint scent of rain, and on the wall before them the letter rested quietly behind the painting. Unread by the world, but no longer unsent. The morning unfolded slowly, like breath after a long-held silence. Light poured gently through the gallery windows, touching the wooden floors in soft, uneven lines. The air carried that faint scent of paint and rain that had become their home. Evelyn woke before Adrian, the stillness around her warm and familiar, her mind hovering somewhere between memory and peace. For the first time in years, she didn't wake with the weight of the past pressing against her chest. The ghosts had quieted. The ache had turned into something softer, something she could live with. She sat up and glanced toward the easel by the window. A blank canvas waited there, untouched since the final portrait. For weeks, she hadn't painted, as if finishing that piece had closed a chapter too deep to reopen. But that morning felt different. There was no longing, no restless need to fill the silence. There was only calm. Adrian stirred beside her, his voice rough with sleep. "More awake early again." "And I couldn't sleep," she said, her lips curving into a faint smile. "The light's too beautiful to waste." He reached for her hand beneath the sheets, his fingers finding hers with the ease of old habit. "You used to say that before every sunrise," he murmured. "Back when we'd stay up painting until dawn." She looked at him then, her heart full of the quiet certainty that she had found her way back. Not just to him, but to herself. And maybe some things never change. He smiled softly, but there was something thoughtful in his gaze. "No," he said. "They just learned how to stay." Later, while he made coffee in the small kitchen, she stood by the window, watching the city come alive below. The street outside glistened faintly with the last traces of dew. A child's laughter drifted up from somewhere near the corner cafe. For years, she had painted this same light through memory. Now she simply let it exist. She realized then that her art had always been her way of trying to hold on to time. But some moments, she thought, are meant to be lived, not captured. Adrian joined her a moment later, handing her a cup. "You know," he said, glancing toward the canvas, "it's strange seeing it blank. Feels like the calm before something." "And maybe it is," she said. "See, but for once, I'm not in a hurry to fill it." He chuckled quietly. "You used to hate blank spaces." She sipped her coffee, the warmth curling through her chest. "And maybe I finally learned that even silence can be beautiful." They sat together for a long while, the quiet between them effortless. Outside, the first soft gusts of spring brushed through the open window, scattering petals from a nearby tree. The breeze lifted one small photograph from the shelf, the picture of the two of them on the bridge years ago, edges worn from being held too many times. Evelyn caught it before it fell, smiling faintly at the memory it carried. "Used to think that bridge was a curse," Adrian said softly, watching her. "Every time I passed it, it reminded me of what I lost." She turned the photograph over in her hands. And now it feels like the place where life began again," he said. Like it was waiting for us to find our way back." She nodded, her throat tightening with the warmth of understanding. "It was never the bridge that broke us," she said quietly. "It was time, but time brought us home too." He smiled, and for a moment, neither spoke. The sound of the city deepened, the hum of footsteps, the flutter of pigeons, the far-off echo of a bell tower marking the hour. Evelyn set the photograph back in its place and crossed to the easel. She stood there for a moment, her fingers brushing lightly over the edge of the canvas. Adrian watched her, saying nothing. When she finally picked up her brush, he smiled, the faintest relief in his expression, as if her silence had just turned into another kind of promise. She didn't think as she painted. Her hand moved instinctively, the strokes soft and fluid. It wasn't a portrait this time. It was light, the pale gold of morning, the faint blue of sky reflected in glass, the tender blush of dawn on stone. She painted peace. She painted the sound of quiet. When she finished, she stepped back, her chest rising and falling with an unfamiliar steadiness. Adrian moved beside her, his voice low. "It's different from anything you've done before." "It's what I feel," she said. "Not what I remember." He nodded slowly. "It feels alive." She smiled faintly, setting her brush down. "And it's enough." They stood there together, their hands finding each other once more. The painting before them shimmered faintly in the morning light, a reflection not of the past, but of everything that had survived it. Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice soft. "Do you ever think we had to lose everything to see what mattered most?" Adrian's thumb brushed against her hand. "Maybe," he said, "but I think what mattered most never really left. It just waited for us to stop running." Outside, the city bloomed into full morning. The sound of a bicycle bell rang somewhere down the street, followed by the low, distant song of a church choir. The world felt wide and quiet all at once, as if holding its breath for them. Evelyn's gaze lingered on the painting one last time before she turned away. "I think I'm done searching," she said softly. Adrian looked at her, understanding in his eyes. "You don't have to search anymore. You're here." They walked toward the door, their fingers intertwined, the sunlight trailing behind them like a promise. The gallery, now filled with warmth and quiet, seemed to exhale, its walls no longer echoing with loss, but with something gentler, something eternal. As they stepped outside, the world greeted them with the hush of a new beginning, the sound of footsteps in the distance, the breeze carrying the scent of wet earth, the faint, rhythmic beating of their joined hearts. And somewhere, in that fragile stillness between one breath and the next, love began again.